It is the beginning of a new year. This reading is from Exodus chapter 3. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that the bush was on fire. It did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. This is the beginning of a new year. The young Moses had seen the suffering of his people. He knew that he was to be their deliverer, but in his early years he was an impulsive man. He killed an Egyptian taskmaster and was forced to flee for his life. He had to spend 40 years in God's school of the desert. So Moses, the young man, turns into Moses, the old man. For 40 years, he worked as a shepherd in the desert. At the age of 80 years, Moses, having failed to be the deliverer God intended and needed, after spending all those years of obscurity in the desert that followed, must have felt completely unusable by God. In his first 40 years in Egypt, Moses had learned the skills of worldly leadership, how to be the leader of men. In God's school of the desert, he spent another 40 years learning the qualities of spiritual leadership, patience, maturity, sensitivity in listening to the word of God, the voice of God. His 40-year stay in the desert was not wasted. Moses had some rough edges that had to be dealt with, such as his arrogance and his quick temper. Now, after what seems like a lifetime for us, 80 years, God was ready to use Moses for his purposes. This is the beginning of a new year. I'm sure we've all been guilty of doing some wrong things in our lives, haven't we? I won't ask you to confess them now. Save that for later. I'm sure we've all thought at one time or another, well, that's it, I've blown it. Or it's too late now, or God seems to use other people, but he doesn't seem to use me. Well, God is going to pick Moses up and put him back into his original place that he had for him. But first, he needs to get his attention. This is where we come to our story for this morning. Exodus chapter 3, we read that Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the back of the desert. He came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Mount Horeb, later to be known as Mount Sinai. This place is significant not for where it was, but for who was there. God was there on that mountain that day. And that was where God was ready to call Moses back into his service. So the first thing we notice about this calling of Moses is that God often shows himself in unexpected places and unexpected ways. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush. So he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, but the bush was not consumed. The bush is probably just your basic desert scrub bush, just like countless of other bushes around and about at that time. The Hebrew word says it's a thorny shrub. The bush was not different or remarkable, but what was happening to it was certainly different and remarkable. The bush was on fire, but it did not burn down. This event was out of the ordinary because we're told that the Moses turned aside to examine this bush, to look at it more closely. Now, I wonder if perhaps God has been trying to get your attention in some way, maybe in a less dramatic way than a burning bush, but has he been trying to get your attention, getting you to turn aside and look at something? This is the beginning of a new year. Sometimes we get so used to the life we are living that we just don't notice anything else going on. There's a road sign in Australia. It says, "Be careful which rut you choose because you'll be in it for the next 100 miles." Yes. Our lives can be a bit like that, can we not? We get used to things. We develop habits and routines. Perhaps God has been trying for some time to get Moses' attention out there in the desert. I wonder how long he's been trying to get your attention. And God often shows himself when we are engaged in the ordinary things of life. What happened to Moses happened on a seemingly ordinary day, just like any one of the other 14,000 days that he spent in the desert. Moses had settled down and perhaps come to terms with the idea that he would never be a deliverer of his people. Day in, day out, he carried out the duties of a shepherd and a father and a husband. Moses had now been doing the same thing over and over, day in and day out, for 40 years. He probably thought nothing's going to change now, but that is to forget what God can do. In the common, ordinary, everyday circumstances of our lives, God occasionally does something altogether extraordinary. He burns a bush, as it were. In our world today, it could just as easily come in the form of some other disruption to our routine, an accident or an illness, an unwelcome change in our circumstances, the loss of a job, the loss of a partner. God may get our attention right in the middle of some change in our day-to-day lives. We may call them coincidences, but these are often not chance events. They are God's way of tapping you on the shoulder so that you will take notice of what he has to say. And he can do so in less dramatic ways, such as when you're reading the Bible, maybe even listening to a sermon. Any of these events in our lives can be prompts to listen to God. For our Creator God may take those moments to grab our attention and transform our lives. God's call is a call to turn aside and to listen to him. Moses said, "I will now turn aside and see this great sight, why the bush does not burn." So when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, "Moses, Moses!" And he said, "Here I am." Notice that Moses does something here. He turns aside. In other words, he's prompted by God, the burning bush, and he stops what he's doing to see what is happening. When God speaks to us, it's time for us, like Moses, to turn aside from our day-to-day lives with all our prejudices, our complacency, maybe memories of past failures. What is it going to take for God to get your attention? What would persuade you to stop what you're doing long enough to consider what God might be trying to tell you, whatever is happening in your life? What is it going to take before you will say, "I'm going to look into this. I'm going to stop for long enough to see what God might be trying to say to me"? Moses did just that. And what he discovered was nothing less than God's purpose for his life. It was not until Moses turned aside that God spoke. From the midst of a bush, Moses heard his name being called. And he said, "Here I am here. Yes, Lord. What do you want of me, Lord?" Through the 4 decades that Moses spent in the desert of Midian, there's no record that God ever spoke to him before. In fact, it had been over 400 years since we have a record of God speaking to the children of Israel. Well, this can be the Lord's way. Without a hint of warning, he speaks to ordinary people on ordinary days in the midst of their ordinary routines. There are days in all of our lives that will come unannounced, unheralded. There's no angelic voices to warn us what is going to happen that will change our lives forever. It's only years later, when we look back, that we understand that that was a turning point for us. We never know what each day will bring. Some days open with a flood of sunshine. Other days the skies are laden with heavy dark clouds. Some days are a thrill to live, and others just have to be endured. Some days will hold a wedding, and other days a funeral. In verse 4 it says, "When the Lord saw that he turned aside to look." And then in verse 5, "Then he said, 'Do not draw near this place. Take your sandals off your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground.'" We must see that the "when" of verse 4 is connected with the "then" of verse 5. It's only after Moses has stopped in his tracks and said, "Here I am, Lord," that God began to give him specific instructions. He first told Moses to remove his sandals because he was on holy ground. This was not some beautiful or ornate sanctuary, just a lonely hillside. The Hebrew word translated holy literally means separated. God is calling Moses to separate himself. God is saying, "I want you to separate yourself from your past, perhaps your past failures. I want you to separate yourself from your present fears. I want you to give me your undivided attention, and I want you to listen to what I'm saying." Then God tells Moses that he is the God of the past, even of his past. In verse 6 he says, "Moreover, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. We might read this list and see these as a list of great Bible characters, superstars, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. But in reality, they were just ordinary men with deep flaws. You and I qualify for the service of the Lord just as we are, just as they were, failures and all. Had it not been for the grace of God, not one of these men would have accomplished anything of lasting worth. God is saying, "Moses, I am the God of men and women who have failed. I'm the God of ordinary people who are used in extraordinary ways." This is the beginning of a new year. God delights in using ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. Verse 7, he says, "I have surely seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. And I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows." God reveals his heart to Moses. "I have seen, I have heard, I know their sorrows." God is reassuring him that he's been watching the situation. He's aware of what's happening. He's heard every cry and every act of oppression he has seen. He knows right down to the core exactly where you are in your life. He sees, he is aware, and best of all, he cares. The voice of God speaking to Moses has said, "I know what is going on in Egypt." And perhaps Moses is thinking, "Well, then maybe, Lord, you can do something about it." And suddenly he hears the words that must have stunned him all the way down to his sandals. Well, his bare feet, because he didn't have sandals on. In verse 8, he gives Moses the rest of the story. "I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians." Yes, to bring them up from the land to a good and large land, a land flowing with milk and honey. At last, Lord. "Now, therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me." Oh, yes. "And I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them." Thank you, Lord. "Come now, therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. What, me? Moses must be thinking. Me? I'm a shepherd. It was Moses, the old man, the shepherd, who was indeed to do the work of delivering God's people. So be careful what you pray for, folks. God may use you to provide the answer to all sorts of problems in this life. For God has said, I have come down to deliver them, and I will send you to Pharaoh. And we stand at the beginning of a new year. What did the burning bush experience do for Moses? What is God saying to each one of us? The Lord wanted to move Moses on from his comfortable existence into the work for which he had been called, for which he was destined. Moses was never the same again. He had this new intimacy with God. He knew him as a friend. The experience provided him with new motivation. His past failures were forgotten. He received this new power for his call to service. The same can be true for each one of us for this coming year. God's job description for you will not be the same as for Moses, but it will be just as real and perhaps just as challenging. Remember that God looks not for your ability, but for your availability. And it's up to each one of us to say, as Moses said, here I am, Lord. I am here. I'm ready. Come, Lord.